The year was 1887, and the land west of the Black Hills held its breath. It was a place of harsh truths and little mercy, a landscape scraped raw by wind and sun, where the horizon was a blade that separated the unforgiving earth from an endless, indifferent sky. For Arthur, a boy of 13 years, this land was not a promise but a penance. He lived on its frayed edge in the shadow of Redemption Creek, a town whose name was a bitter joke. He was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel in his bones. Arthur was an orphan, a piece of human driftwood cast aside by the currents of sickness and misfortune that had claimed his parents 2 winters past. He existed in the spaces people overlooked, a collapsed lean, to behind the abandoned livery, a hollowed-out cottonwood down by the water, the cold comfort of shadows. The townspeople saw him not as a boy, but as a problema stray dog to be shooed away, a walking reminder of the fragility of their own hard-won existence. Their charity was a cold, thin gruel of suspicion, and their kindness was a coin he had never been offered. So he learned the ways of the quiet things. He learned to read the subtle language of bent twigs and faint impressions in the dust. He knew the habits of the jackrabbit and the grouse, the secret places where wild onions grew, and the precise tension a snare required to be quick and final. His life was a silent, solitary routine measured in the pangs of his stomach and the slow turning of the seasons. He was a ghost haunting the periphery of a world that refused to see him, his only companions the wind and a loneliness so vast and deep it felt like a part of his own anatomy. His days were governed by a simple, brutal calculus of survival. Wake before the sun painted the eastern cliffs, check the snares, and hope for a rabbit or a quail. Avoid Garrett Shaw, the town's barrel-chested sheriff, whose gaze felt like a physical blow. Scavenge for anything the world might have discarded: a dropped nail, a length of twine, a half-rotten apple tossed from a wagon. Then retreat to the creek, the one place that felt like his own, where the rustle of leaves was a kinder sound than any human voice he knew. It was a life of profound silence, a state of resignation that had hardened his young face and put a permanent caution in his eyes. He was trapped not by walls, but by an invisibility he had learned to wear like a cloak. One afternoon, when the sun hung hot and heavy in the sky like a brass coin, Arthur was downstream from his usual haunts, chasing the faint hope of a fish in a deeper pool. The air was thick and still, the drone of insects, a constant, drowsy hum. It was then that a different sound cut through the quieter, low, guttural noise, choked and desperate. It was not the cry of any animal he recognized. Fear, his oldest and most loyal advisor, told him to flee. Trouble in this land was a predator, and he had survived by being small and silent and unseen. But something else, a flicker of forgotten empathy, held him fast. He moved slowly, his bare feet making no sound on the dry earth, his body low to the ground. He crept through a thicket of willows, their leaves whispering against his patched shirt, and peered through the branches. The sight before him stole the air from his lungs. The creek had carved a treacherous bend here, leaving a wide, wet scar of silt and mud that shimmered under the sun. It was quicksand. And in the center of it, sunk to her waist, was a woman. She was Lakota, her dark hair matted with mud, her deerskin dress stained and heavy. One arm was stretched out, her fingers clawing at the soupy earth, while the other was pressed tight against her side. Her face, etched with lines of pain and exhaustion, was turned away from him, but he could see the slow, inexorable pull of the sand as it drew her deeper with every small, panicked movement. An eagle feather, a sacred thing, was tangled in her hair, now caked and pathetic. He saw that her leg was bent at an unnatural angle, trapped not just by the sand, but by an injury that had likely sent her tumbling into this trap. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. The people of Redemption Creek spoke of the Lakota as ghosts or devils, savages who haunted the edges of their world. He had been raised on a diet of fear, taught that an encounter like this was a death sentence. The sheriff, Mr. Shaw, would call him a fool, or worse. the whole town would turn on him. He should run. He should disappear back into the landscape and forget what he had seen. It was the sensible, safe thing to do. But he couldn't. He saw not a savage, but a person drowning in mud. He saw the same terror and desperation he felt in his own heart on the coldest nights. Her struggle was a raw, physical fact that cut through the thick layers of prejudice he had been fed. For a long, silent moment, the orphan boy and the sinking woman existed in a world of their own, caught in a tableau of quiet horror. And in that moment, Arthur made a choice. He pushed aside the willows and stepped into the open. He was done being a ghost. The woman's head snapped toward the sound. Her dark eyes, wide with a fresh wave of fear, fixed on him. She saw a scrawny white boy in tattered clothes, a creature from the world that had stolen her people's land and scattered their lives to the wind. Her body went rigid, her struggle ceasing as she braced for the final cruelty. Arthur held up his hands, palms open, a gesture he hoped would translate across the chasm of their two worlds. I'll help," he said, his voice a reedy crackle, rusty from disuse. He knew he couldn't just wade in after her. The quicksand would take him too. His mind, honed by the practical problems of survival, raced. He looked around, his eyes scanning the creek bank. A deadfall cottonwood lay nearby, its branches bleached white by the sun. He ran to it, his bare feet ignoring the sharp stones, and put his shoulder against a long, sturdy limb. He grunted with effort, his thin muscles straining as he worked it free from the tangle. It was heavy, almost too heavy, but the sight of her sinking, another inch gone, gave him a strength born of pure adrenaline. He dragged the branch to the edge of the mire, shoving it out across the surface toward her. "Take it," he yelled, his voice stronger now. "Grab on." She stared at the branch, then back at him, her eyes filled with a fierce, assessing suspicion. Trust was a currency neither of them possessed. For her, a white hand offering help could easily be a trick. For him, every second he remained here was a gamble. He saw the hesitation, the conflict in her gaze. "Please," he said, the words soft but urgent. "It'll pull you down." Her gaze lingered on his face for a moment longer, searching. Perhaps she saw something in his earnest, frightened eyes that was not a lie. Slowly, painstakingly, she reached out her free hand, her fingers stretching, trembling, until they brushed against the wood. She wrapped her hand around it, her grip surprisingly strong. "Pull when I say," Arthur instructed, his voice taking on a strange authority he didn't know he had. He laid his body flat on the stable ground, digging his toes into the dirt for leverage, and took hold of his end of the branch. "Now." He pulled. The branch bowed, and for a terrifying moment, nothing happened. He could feel the immense, sucking force of the mud. The woman cried out, a sharp gasp of pain as the movement jarred her injured leg. He gritted his teeth, sweat stinging his eyes, and pulled again, throwing every ounce of his wiry frame into the effort. He felt a slight give. The seal of the quicksand was beginning to break. "Again," he shouted, more to himself than to her. He pulled and she pulled, their desperate struggle a silent, straining duet. The mud slurped and groaned, reluctantly releasing its grip. Slowly, agonizingly, inch by inch, he dragged her toward the solid bank. Her body scraped against the silt, heavy and limp. When her torso was finally clear, he scrambled to her side, grabbing her under the arms and hauling her the last few feet onto the grass. She collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, her body trembling with shock and exhaustion. Mud clung to her like a second skin. Arthur stumbled back, his own body shaking, his lungs burning. For a long time there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the indifferent hum of the insects. He had done it. He had pulled her from the earth's greedy mouth. And now a new and more complicated fear began to settle in. What was he supposed to do now? She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her movements stiff and pained. Her eyes, when they met his, were no longer filled with fear, but with a deep, bottomless exhaustion and a flicker of something else, a cautious, weary appraisal. She was alive, but she was hurt, and they were alone together at the edge of a world that wanted them both gone. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the mud that still clung to her. Arthur stood a few feet away, watching her, his own adrenaline slowly draining away and leaving a hollow ache in its place. He was acutely aware of the risk he had taken, of the chasm that separated them. She was Lakota, he was white. In the harsh lexicon of the frontier, that was all that was supposed to matter. The woman tried to shift, to sit up properly, but a sharp, biting hiss of pain escaped her lips. She looked down at her right leg, which was still half buried in the mud at the very edge of the bank. Arthur followed her gaze and saw the problem. Her ankle was twisted at a grotesque angle, already beginning to swell. It was clearly broken. She was grounded, helpless. His first instinct, the one drilled into him by years of self-preservation, was to leave. He had done his part. He had saved her from the quicksand. Now he should melt back into the trees and let her people, whoever they were, find her. But he couldn't bring himself to move. Leaving her here, injured and exposed, felt like a different kind of cruelty, a betrayal of the strange, fragile connection forged in their shared struggle. He took a hesitant step closer and pointed at her ankle. "Broke?" he asked, the single word feeling clumsy and inadequate. She gave a short, sharp nod, her jaw tight. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the wounded limb as if staring at it could somehow mend it. Her pride was a palpable thing, a shield she held up even now. She would not ask this boy for anything more. Arthur's mind churned. He couldn't take her to town. The sheriff would lock her up, or worse. The townsfolk would form a mob, their fear and hatred igniting like dry tinder. He was on his own. That meant bringing her to the only sanctuary he had, the derelict lean to he called home. The thought was terrifying. It was one thing to help a stranger in a moment of crisis. It was another thing entirely to bring the crisis home with him. He looked at her again. He saw the lines of pain around her eyes, the stoic set of her mouth. He saw a strength that shamed his own fear. In that moment, she was not an enemy or a savage. She was just a woman who was hurt and alone, same as him. "I have a place," he said quietly, surprising himself. "It ain't much, but it's dry, safe." She finally looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face, weighing his offer. He could see the internal debate, the deep-seated mistrust, warring with the practical reality of her situation. He waited, his own fate hanging on her decision as much as hers did. After a long moment that felt like an hour, she gave another small, almost imperceptible nod. Getting her there was a grueling ordeal. He found another sturdy branch to serve as a crutch. With him supporting most of her weight on one side and the branch on the other, they began the slow, painful journey away from the creek. Every step was an agony for her, and he could feel her tremors of pain through his own thin frame. He didn't know her name, and she didn't know his. They didn't speak. The only language between them was the shared rhythm of her pained breathing and his grunts of exertion. It was a pilgrimage of two outcasts, moving through a landscape that was hostile to them both. His shelter was little more than a pile of scavenged planks and rotted timbers propped against a rock outcropping, shielded from the main trail by a dense stand of pines. It was pathetic, but it was his. He helped her inside, easing her down onto his own sorry excuse for a beda pile of dry leaves and grasses, covered with a threadbare blanket he'd found behind the mercantile. The space was small and smelled of dust and wood smoke. He built a small, smokeless fire just outside the entrance, his hands moving with the familiar, competent motions of his daily survival. He fetched water from a hidden spring in his only bucket and brought it to her. She drank deeply, her eyes closing for a moment in relief. He looked at her ankle again. The swelling was worse, the skin tight and discolored. He knew from setting traps and seeing injured animals that a break needed to be set, or it would heal wrong. He had no idea how to do that for a person, but he had seen his father splint the leg of a calf once, a hazy memory from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "I have to," he began, gesturing toward the injury. "It needs to be straight." She understood. A flicker of fear crossed her face, but she masked it with that same iron composure. She lay back and nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the blanket. Arthur's hands trembled as he took her foot. The skin was cool and damp. He took a deep breath, trying to recall the image of his father's confident hands. He pulled, gently but firmly. A terrible, strangled cry was torn from her throat, and her entire body arched in agony. He felt a sickening pop as the bones shifted. For a horrifying second, he thought he had made it worse. He let go, scrambling back, his face pale. But when he dared to look again, the angle was better. The worst of the distortion was gone. She lay panting, sweat beading on her forehead, but the rigid line of her jaw had softened slightly. He had not failed. He found 2 flat pieces of scavenged lumber and tore strips from the bottom of his own shirt to create a crude splint, binding it as tightly as he dared. He spent the rest of the day tending to her in a state of quiet, focused anxiety. He had a rabbit from his morning snare, and he cooked it over the fire, the simple meal feeling like a momentous offering. He brought her a portion on a piece of bark. She ate slowly, methodically, without a word. The silence in the tiny shelter was no longer the empty silence of his solitude, but a shared silence, thick with unspoken questions and a fragile, emerging truce. He sat by the entrance, keeping watch, his world now shrunk to this small space and the injured woman within it. He was no longer just a survivor, he was a guardian. The sun began to set, bleeding purple and orange across the sky. In the dying light, he watched her as she drifted into an exhausted sleep. He saw that the mud had dried on her skin and in her hair. Gently, so as not to wake her, he took a clean rag and a small bowl of water and began to wipe the grime from her face. Her features, underneath the dirt, were strong and noble, carved with a quiet dignity. He cleaned the eagle feather in her hair as best he could, smoothing it out. It was a strange, intimate act, a gesture of care he hadn't shown anyone since his mother had fallen ill. As he worked, he felt the last of his fear of her as a savage fall away, replaced by a simple, profound sense of shared humanity. For 3 days, a strange and quiet rhythm established itself in the lean-to. Arthur foraged and hunted with a new urgency, no longer just for himself but for 2. He would return to find her watching him, her gaze intense and unreadable. The communication between them was sparse, built of gestures and single words. He learned that a slight inclination of her head meant thank you, and a certain look in her eye meant she was in pain. On the 2nd day, she spoke for the first time since the creek. He had brought her a brew of willow bark tea, something he knew helped with fever and pain. As he handed her the tin cup, her fingers brushed his, and she looked directly at him. "Winona," she said, her voice soft but clear. She touched her own chest. "Arthur," he replied, startled. The exchange of names felt like a treaty being signed. A bridge, however rickety, had been built across the chasm of their 2 worlds. He started to see her not just as a patient, but as a person. He noticed the way she would watch the birds outside the shelter, her expression wistful. He saw her hands, when not clenched in pain, move with an innate grace as she re-braided her long, dark hair. One afternoon, she pointed to the herbs he was sorting and, using a combination of her own language and gestures, showed him which ones were better for a poultice and which could be used for a soothing wash. He was the provider, but she was the one with knowledge. A quiet respect began to grow in him, a fascination with the world she came from. Winona, in turn, observed the boy. She saw the ingrained poverty of his existence, the worn-out clothes, the constant, gnawing hunger he tried to hide, the profound loneliness that clung to him like a shroud. But she also saw his resilience, his surprising competence in this harsh world. Most importantly, she saw his kindness. He had saved her without hesitation, had tended to her with a gentleness that belied his rough existence. He shared his meager food without question. In his wary, guarded eyes, she saw not the hatred of her enemies, but the deep, unhealed wound of a child who had lost everything. The prejudice she had carried in her own heart, a defense built from a lifetime of conflict and broken promises, began to soften. This boy was not like the others. The change was subtle, a slow thaw in the frozen landscape of their solitude. The silence between them became less tense and more comfortable. Sometimes, as he worked outside the shelter, mending a snare or sharpening a knife, he would feel her eyes on him, and when he looked up, she would offer a small, faint smile. It was a gift more precious than any food or water. For the first time in years, Arthur felt seen. He was no longer a ghost. He was Arthur, and he had a friend named Winona. He started to feel a fierce, protective instinct toward her. This small, broken shelter had become a sanctuary for them both, a tiny island of peace in a hostile sea. But the island was not safe. On the morning of the fourth day, the world outside intruded. Arthur was returning from checking his traps, a skinny squirrel dangling from his hand, when he heard the unmistakable sound of horses, moving not on the main trail, but through the woods, methodically, as if searching. His blood ran cold. He dropped to a crouch, his heart pounding. It couldn't be the sheriff. This was too far off the beaten path. He crept back to the edge of the clearing and peered through the trees. 3 Lakota warriors on horseback were moving in a line, their eyes sweeping the ground. One of them, a man with a face like carved granite and eyes that missed nothing, reined in his horse. He had found their tracks. He pointed, and the others converged. They were coming right for the shelter. Panic seized Arthur. They would see him as a kidnapper, a monster who had harmed their woman. They would not ask questions. He scrambled back to the lean-to, his face ashen. "They're here," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Your people." Winona heard the urgency in his voice and pushed herself up, her face tense. She listened, and her expression changed. It was not fear he saw, but a complex mix of relief and concern. She looked at him, and her gaze was clear and direct. "Do not be afraid, Arthur," she said, her voice calm and steady. But he was terrified. The lead warrior dismounted, a long knife sheathed at his hip, his movements fluid and dangerous. He walked directly to the entrance of the lean-to, his companions flanking him, their faces grim and suspicious. The warrior's eyes fell on Arthur, who stood frozen in the opening, a small, terrified boy standing between him and whatever lay inside. The warrior's gaze was hard, cold, and filled with a lethal promise. He took a step forward, his hand moving toward his knife. Arthur flinched, bracing himself for the blow. "Chayton, stop." The voice came from inside the shelter. It was Winona's voice, but it held an authority Arthur had never heard before. It was not a plea, but a command. The warrior, Chayton, froze instantly. His head snapped up, his hard expression melting into disbelief, then profound relief. He pushed past Arthur and knelt at Winona's side, speaking to her in the rapid, low tones of their language. Arthur stood by, trembling, as the other 2 warriors gathered around, their initial hostility toward him replaced by a confused reverence for the scene inside. They were not just looking for a lost member of their tribe. The way they spoke to her, the way they looked at Herritt was something more. It was worship. Chayton turned his gaze back to Arthur. The suspicion was gone, but a deep, searching question remained. Winona spoke again, her voice soft but firm, and her eyes never left Arthur's face. She was telling them what had happened. Chayton listened, his granite face unreadable, but his eyes kept flicking from her splinted leg to the boy's ragged form. When she finished, a deep silence fell over the small clearing. Just as the fragile peace seemed to settle, a new sound shattered it, the crash of boots and the loud, booming voice of a white man. "All right, you savages, hold it right there." Sheriff Garrett Shaw burst into the clearing, his shotgun leveled. Behind him were 5 townsmen, a hastily formed posse armed with rifles and a self-righteous fury. One of them must have seen Arthur's tracks leading off the trail with those of a shoeless person and reported it. To them, the scene was exactly what they expected, the poor orphan boy, cornered by a band of hostile natives. "We're here to get the boy," Shaw bellowed, his face red with exertion and anger. "Let him go, and we might let you walk away." Chaitan and his warriors rose as one, their hands moving to their own weapons. They turned to face the new threat, their bodies forming a protective wall in front of Winona. The air crackled with tension, a single spark away from exploding into a massacre. Arthur was trapped in the middle, a pawn in a war he wanted no part of. The two worlds he had tried to navigate had finally collided, and he was standing at the epicenter. The clearing was a tinderbox. On one side stood Sheriff Shaw and his posse, their faces a mixture of fear and grim determination, their rifles glinting in the dappled sunlight. On the other, Chaitan and his two warriors, their bodies coiled like springs, their expressions cold, with a battle-hardened resolve. Between them, in the heart of the storm, was Arthur, and behind him, in the shadows of the lean-to, was Winona. "I said, give us the boy." Shaw's voice was a ragged bark of authority. "He's a ward of this town. You've got no claim on him." Chaitan let out a low, dangerous sound, a growl from deep in his chest. He didn't speak English, but he understood the language of threat perfectly. His hand tightened on the hilt of his knife. Arthur's mind screamed at him to run, to hide, to become the ghost he had always been. This was a fight between men, between forces far greater than him. But then he glanced back at Winona. He saw her face, pale but resolute, and he remembered the feeling of her hand gripping the branch, the shared struggle, the quiet trust they had built in this small, sacred space. This shelter was their home. He had promised her it was safe. Something inside him shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was joined by something else, something new and hot and fierce. It was courage. He took a step forward, out of the shadow of the lean-to, and into the charged space between the two groups. He was just a boy, small and scrawny, his clothes little more than rags, but as he planted his feet, he seemed to cast a shadow far larger than his frame. "He's wrong," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. Every eye swiveled to him. "They didn't take me." Sheriff Shaw's face contorted in disbelief. "Son, you don't have to be scared. We're here to help you. Just step aside." "No," Arthur said, shaking his head. He stood his ground, placing himself squarely in front of the path to Winona. "You don't understand. She was hurt. She was in the quicksand, and her leg is broken. I pulled her out. I brought her here." He pointed a trembling finger at Chaitan. "They aren't hurting me. They're her people. They came to find her." His words, simple and honest, hung in the air, a truth so contrary to the narrative of hate and fear that for a moment no one knew how to react. A few men in the posse shifted uncomfortably, their certainty beginning to waver. The sheriff's face hardened, his condescension curdling into rage. "You're a fool, boy, a traitor to your own kind. They've filled your head with lies. Now get out of the way before you get hurt." He raised his shotgun, gesturing with the barrel. At that moment, a clear, commanding voice cut through the tension. "He speaks the truth." Winona emerged from the shelter, leaning heavily on the arm of one of the younger warriors. She moved with a pained grace, her back straight, her head held high. Her presence radiated an authority that transcended her injuries and her deerskin dress. She was no longer just a woman, she was a queen taking her court. She fixed Sheriff Shaw with a gaze that was as steady and ancient as the hills. She spoke in flawless, unaccented English, her voice devoid of fear. "This boy, Arthur, saved my life. When I was helpless, he showed me kindness. When I was in pain, he gave me comfort. He has more honor in his small body than you and all your armed men possess." A stunned silence fell over the posse. They had come expecting to fight savages, to rescue a boy from a monstrous fate. They were not prepared for an eloquent, dignified woman who spoke their own language with more poise than they did. They were not prepared for the fierce loyalty of the orphan boy they had always dismissed. Shaw sputtered, his blustering authority punctured. "Now, you listen here." "No," Winona interrupted, her voice dropping to a steely quiet. "You will listen. You have come to my friend's home with guns and threats. You have judged without knowledge and condemned without reason. This boy is under my protection now. He and his home. You will leave this place." Chaitan, watching the exchange, saw the courage in Arthur's stance and the power in Winona's words. He understood then. The boy had not just pulled her from the mud, he had shielded her, defended her. He had become one of them in spirit. With a motion so subtle it was almost invisible, Chaitan eased his hand away from his knife. It was a sign of de-escalation, a concession born of respect for the boy's bravery. The sheriff looked from Winona's immovable face to Chaitan's formidable presence, then at his own men. He saw their resolve faltering. He saw doubt in their eyes. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and most importantly, he had lost the moral high ground. His righteous crusade had been exposed as a fool's errand. With a curse spat into the dirt, Shaw lowered his shotgun. "Have it your way, boy," he snarled at Arthur, his voice dripping with venom. "You've made your choice. Don't come crawling to us when your pet wolves turn on you." He turned and stomped back through the trees, his posse trailing behind him, their retreat clumsy and shame-faced. They melted back into the woods, leaving behind a silence that was no longer tense, but filled with a profound, ringing peace. The threat was gone. The battle had been won not with bullets or blades, but with truth and courage. In the quiet aftermath, the clearing felt transformed. The danger had passed, leaving a stillness that felt sacred. Chaitan walked over to Arthur. The tall, formidable warrior, who had been ready to kill moments before, now looked down at the boy with an expression of profound respect. He placed a large, calloused hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. It said, "You are one of us." Winona smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. "You stood, Arthur," she said softly. "When all your life you were taught to run, you stood your ground. For me." He could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. The fear, the adrenaline, it all washed out of him, leaving him feeling shaky but whole. He had faced down the very world that had cast him out, and he had not broken. In the days that followed, the lean-to became a place of healing and transition. Chaitan and his warriors made a camp nearby, standing a silent, watchful guard. They treated Arthur with a quiet deference that bewildered him. They shared their food with him, showed him how to properly fletch an arrow, and spoke to him in gestures and smiles. He was no longer the town's stray. He was the boy who had protected their sacred woman. He learned that Winona was not a queen in the way of white men, with a crown and a throne. She was a keeper of stories, a spiritual guide, the living heart of her people's traditions and wisdom. To save her was to save a part of their soul. When Winona's ankle was strong enough for travel, they constructed a travois to carry her. The time had come for them to leave. The morning of their departure was crisp and bright. Winona called Arthur to her side. "We are returning to our winter camp," she said. "It is a place of family, of belonging. There is a place for you there, Arthur, a home." She held out her hand. In her palm lay a small, intricately carved bird, fashioned from a piece of smooth, dark wood. "This is for you, so you remember that courage allows you to fly." Arthur took the carving, its weight solid and real in his palm. He looked at Winona, at Chaitan, at the others. He saw in their faces an offer of everything he had ever been denied, a family, a purpose, a place to belong. He looked back at his pitiful lean-to, a monument to his loneliness, and then at the vast, open land where their camp lay. The world had always seen him as an orphan, a piece of nothing, but an act of kindness, a simple choice to help a stranger in the mud, had redefined him. He was no longer Arthur, the forgotten boy. He was Arthur, the friend of Winona, the boy who stood. He looked at the path leading back toward the hostile silence of Redemption Creek, and then at the trail leading away with the Lakota. He had been alone for so long. He did not want to be alone anymore. A slow smile spread across his face, the first true, unguarded smile of his young life. He tucked the carved bird safely into his pocket and turned to face his new family, ready to walk toward the horizon. He had found his home, not in a place of wood and nails, but in the shelter of a bond forged in mud, tested by fire, and built on the unshakable foundation of unexpected kindness.